Now, great pleasure to introduce my good colleague, Ellen Hazelkorn. She's perhaps no one better known, I think, and more active and more engaged and more of a leader in relation to higher education studies than Ellen, who in fact is a policymaker and an advisor of other policymakers in numerous countries. Her core work is as joint managing partner of BH Associates Education Consultants based in Dublin. She's a professor emeritus with the Technological University of Dublin and joint editor of policy reviews in higher education. She's a member of the CGHE Advisory Board and the CGHE Research Management Committee, and a research fellow with the Centre for International Higher Education in Boston College. A member of the Quality Board for Icelandic Higher Education, the EU Higher Education for Smart Specialisation Advisory Group, and the Committee for Strategic Advice, EURASHE, the European Association of Institutions in Higher Education. Strong role in Europe, role elsewhere in the world as well. Was a policy advisor, a board member of the Higher Education Academy in Ireland, continues to maintain a close interest in the development of tertiary education in Ireland. Was a member of the Commission for the College of the Future in the UK, Tertiary Education Future Initiative, Royal Society of Edinburgh and Youth Academy of Scotland, and famously reviewed post-compulsory education in Wales, where she recommended the tertiary approach, which Wales subsequently adopted and which is now being imitated, I think, successively in Scotland, with a somewhat different set of proposals, and is being considered, I think, increasingly in England as well. So a real leader in our sector, and a great pleasure to hear from her today. I will now pass the screen over to you, Ellen.
Okay, thanks very much. And hello, everyone, wherever you are internationally. So I'm going to talk about tertiary education. I think it's a growing issue, a policy issue internationally. I'm going to put out some ideas, and I'm happy to have a conversation about what are the issues and challenges. This is not, there's no blueprints. There's no one who's got it all right. I had the New Zealanders in town. I'm working from Dublin, and New Zealand was here the beginning of the week. The Tertiary Education Commission talking about how they're moving ahead with these ideas. So I'm going to put up my slides, and we can then have a chat. So I pose it as a question: is it time to rethink our model of post-secondary education? And we all know that really across certainly OECD countries and increasingly over other countries, we are moving increasingly towards near universal or certainly mass higher education. And in many countries, I circled there the EU and the OECD average, and indeed Ireland, where we're up to almost 70% in higher education. And this is a huge achievement. The question really is that as we move forward, as we look at the kinds of changes that are coming at us quite rapidly, how will this shape not just our societies, how we live and work, but also what are the implications for how we look at our system of higher educational provision, post-secondary education, because in the main, that provision has remained largely the same model as if we were dealing, I would say, with still an elite group, a small number of students. And increasingly, there's concern about the other 50%, people left behind, people trying to get into the system, needs around skills, people needing to re-enter, and the changes in society as a whole. And these are the kinds of questions that I just lay out, and kind of as a way of trying to begin to think about what the future might be. So I'm going to raise 4 different issues. One, I'm just going to talk about this shift towards tertiary, what I want to call tertiary ecosystems, just briefly on this changing context and landscape, why we're talking about tertiary, and then some propositions. So not recommendations, I put them out there to kind of stir debate. And so when we look at this, when we start, largely a lot of attention around systems. And the favorite system to look at is California. Oh yeah, right. We've got a system plan, the California Master Plan. And largely this was to introduce to deal with the kinds of discussions that were prompted by the huge growth and massification experience in California. And Clark Kerr, who this is all attributed to, came up with the idea of creating three kind of distinct subsectors, or I might call them tiers, as to how we divide up education largely according to the labor market, issues of talent and knowledge production, and with the opportunity for mobility upwards in the system. And in the sense there was, basically you had the elite research intensive universities, the University of California system, the mid-ranking teaching and research system, the California state system, and then the community colleges. And to some extent, that's an approach copied in many US states, and many other countries look at this quite well. Got quite firm boundaries between each of these subsectors, if we want to call it that. And the master plan, for many people, and has become really personified what we think about systems. And as we move toward this idea of, well, not idea, but as massification took off elsewhere, the conversation switched from the US to Europe and the rest of the world. So I'll just make three quick and very brief observations. First, the focus when we look at systems and when we looked at it in those terms is that the post-secondary, the post-schooling, post-compulsory schooling sector has largely been defined by higher education, or more specifically by research universities. And this is the approach that has largely, so we talk about higher education, we're largely talking about research universities. And over time, the post-secondary sector has largely been associated with the fact that the higher education component constitutes the post-secondary system. And accordingly, all our resources are directed there. The second, the point is that the rest of the post-secondary system, particularly the community college element of it, have been largely airbrushed out of consideration. They've been largely allowed to evolve in an ad hoc kind of different manner, different countries having different approaches. And certainly while this part of the system, the community college, open access, in some cases polytechnic, in some cases known as TVET or VET, or further education, praised as being, as what we would say is a kind of open access area, but regressively, which is a term that's never associated with the funding of post-secondary, but regressively, we tend to fund this sector far less, and the resources accordingly, despite the populations they serve. If this was the way a tax system operated, we'd be up in arms. But there's very little said about this. The kinds of system then that we look at when we look at the idea of both the master plan or binary arrangements that have been introduced in other countries is that they appear to be settled law or settled arrangements. And to some extent, they have been important in terms of maintaining some kind of staticness in the system, not allowing drift, not allowing homogenization and so on. But they've also—
Helen, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're not seeing any slides. If you're showing slides, there's nothing showing.
Okay. Yes, sorry. Okay, I know what I did. I forgot to put it up. Okay, sorry about that, guys. Oh, crikeys. Hold on. Let me start again.
You were very articulate, but
yeah, sorry about that. Sorry. All right, hold on. Now I have to figure out what I did with my slides. Oh. I'm glad you said that.
Well, we've been exchanging messages about it, and I've been writing messages to you in the chat for a little while.
Oh, I know. I can't see the chat.
All right. Okay.
It comes up.
Good on you. Now we can see the screen. And
Okay, so I have to share it again. Sorry.
now it's gone again.
Yeah. That's because I did something queer on it. Okay, can you see it now?
Not yet. Yeah, it's coming through now. Got it.
Okay.
Yep.
That's okay?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay,
You just have to bring it into full screen view.
yeah, okay. How's that?
Yeah, it looks like it's perfect.
Okay,
Very nice.
right,
Nice.
okay. Sorry
Mm.
about that. Sorry, everyone. So, okay, so there we are. Basically, it's been a very static type system, largely reinforcing what I would say are social stratifications, ladders to the market, and I would also argue quite simplistic ideas about knowledge and knowledge production, and reinforcing differences between academic and applied and all kinds of stuff in a linear model of knowledge. So the idea of systemness has emerged over the past while, credited to Neil Smeltzer, but then operationalized by Nancy Zimpher, who was the chancellor of the SUNY system, the State University of New York. And Nancy's view when she took over the SUNY system has three research intensive parts of the system and a mass then of community colleges, smaller colleges, and also some research institutes. There's about 60 components to the SUNY system. And she talks about this system as being coordinating activities in a way that it behaves more powerfully than what can be achieved by individuals. And the term I use to describe this is maximizing capacity beyond individual capability. So instead, I really want to talk about the tertiary ecosystem. And this is really expanding our lens to embrace the wider post-secondary system. And also because parts of the system, not just on a narrow educational wise, but in general, when we start looking at all the different parts and the policy overlaps, are such that it's not possible that the educational system stands on its own either. Where the education is also one part of a linear scale, if we want to put it like that, from preschool up to higher and advanced educations or older lifelong learning opportunities. And so we're looking at a much more complex range of different partners and providers. And in this, I'm looking at the way in which different types of education, training, and research and innovation actors interact, sometimes in open and hidden ways, sometimes in formal, informal, and non-formal arrangements. We're looking at a space which is very dynamic, different types of organizations and providers working together individually, collectively, and so on. And so it's a much more dynamic way of looking at how we see the post-secondary system. And as I said, underpinning this, I've just 5 sets of ideas for which you're all probably hugely familiar. One is this idea around civic engaged university, that's the term, in terms of foregrounding engagement, co-production of knowledge, and public value. We're looking at R&I networks and clusters, this idea of interaction between different actors, working through multilateral, interregional, and global networks, complex problems being solved by collaborative solutions. Arguably, this is what the SDGs is all about. The issue of geography of place, something that features very poorly both on the policy sphere and also from the educational sphere, and looking at place-based, place-responsive policies and understanding the relationship between place, physical place, and socioeconomic and other issues. Issues around governance, which to me is always important in terms of of moving beyond voluntarism or individualist goodwill to something that's become sustainable. And fundamentally, this idea about biodiversity, which is very much associated usually with issues around sustainability, but I want to bring it in here to talk about ecosystems. And so these concepts of what I call the 4 C's of coherence, collaboration, coordination, and co-production are really key underpinning ideas, I think, that we need to think about. And so when we look at this changing landscape, we have, as I said, this increasing share of learners receiving a tertiary qualification and exceeding, in many cases, upwards of, and certainly over 50%. But what's interesting is that when we look at those who have completed, the overwhelming majority have a BA degree and very few taking short cycle. We see that here in this OECD data here from 2018, in which the blue tells us the bachelor's equivalents, and the orange is the master's. And then we have a sprinkling of countries moving out as we move into the more European base, if I put it like that, and other countries offering short cycle tertiary. And one of the trends that we do think a lot about is when we look at skills. And so skills is a huge discussion. This is the European Year of Skills. It started at the beginning of June. The EU always has a year of something, but this is a year of skills. And we spend a lot of time looking at skills, but we tend to focus on the fact that we're needing more and more higher level skills. That's absolutely true. But what we ignore in this whole thing is that almost half the skills we need are also middle level skills. And we tend to ignore that component of the story. So some issues that emerge for this is this increasing porosity that's developed over time. Some people in some countries that I have visited recently seem to have just recognized that these differences between vocational, professional, and academic have become extremely porous over the years. But in fact, our structures, or perhaps our attitudes, have become quite fossilized. In fact, most of the courses within our traditional universities are in fact what we might designate as professional or vocational education. And but we still, some of this nomenclature has changed over time, but to a large extent, the academic community, and to some extent the policy community, is always referred to. We have universities and non-universities. Now, again, if we put this in the context of people, we'd never refer to people as non-people, and we'd be into a whole debate about racism. But we have othered these other institutions. And what we see is that as higher education participation has risen, TVET or further education has declined, often being seen as an alternative route either to higher ed or a provider of last resort. For people who can't get in anywhere else, they'll go down the road to the local tech. And as demographics has shifted, particularly as we see a growing decline in many countries around the traditional college-ready student population, piece now out in the Chronicle of Higher Ed, just yesterday, again, talking about the huge decline in the US, we see universities now fighting with others, what I call predatory behavior or cannibalism of courses, egged on by funding systems, which are largely about funding the number of students that we take in. We see this kind of behavior happening. We also have a big debate occurring around skills and skill match. And it is, I mean, it's absolutely true that the relationship between qualifications and occupations is complex and multifaceted. But there are some genuine concerns that are out there. This long list of critical middle skills that are missing. I've looked at the list in the Irish case recently, and it's enormous, the number of skills for which we can't as a society function. PIAC, which comes out, points increasingly to poor adult skills, poor adult literacy and numeracy skills. Digital skills is a huge problem. And we have growing evidence of employers in many cases bypassing academic credentials and developing their own in a way that raises questions fundamentally for quality assurance. So there's a range of issues that are emerging. Regional disparities is a huge issue and a huge focus. You have the leveling up agenda in the UK. We have the smart specialization and regional development policies in across the EU and other countries. It's part of Biden's strategy. We have all these issues, but increasing to overcome what we're calling the regional disparities and the deindustrialization of parts of the country or world. We also have spent a lot of time looking at regional development, but have focused primarily around research-intensive R&I strategies, primarily on universities and setting up small companies and industrial innovation hubs and so on. But we've ignored in this the fact that it's primarily people who catalyze knowledge, who develop new ideas, and who lead innovation, not institutions. And indeed, all the literature will tell us that it's not really the universities doing this, it's outside the university sector. And so there's a wide range of issues that emerge in this context. And so we're now beginning to, I think, focus on this. So why tertiary? I mean, essentially, what we're really beginning to look at in a much more coherent way is the landscape post-secondary schooling. What Bologna refers to as a third cycle, some countries call it third level. It varies. Post-secondary is a common term. If there's compulsory that's earlier, it might be called post-compulsory, but whatever. And ISCED refers to everything above short cycle level 5 to level 8. The OECD has finally acknowledged that while the common term was higher education, we now realize that there's a diversity of institutions and programs. To some extent, this was already there. The OECD was late coming to it. And it depends where you are in the world, and countries do this differently. That's because aside from the universities, which are clearly differentiated, we've got a very clear structure of BA, MA, and doctoral programs. Everything else within the post-secondary space is it's context dependent. They carry different names. They carry different qualifications and certifications. They're hard to compare because everyone's got their own history and the way things have evolved over time. But so we talk, even the terminology between TVET, VET, FET varies. We've got the polytechnics, but sometimes they're called University of Applied Sciences. And the university colleges and universities. But after that, we've got adult and community education. We have literacy and numeracy. Our further education system in Ireland covers everything from level 1, which is the beginning of our qualifications framework, all the way to level 6. And that's because we're dealing with literacy and numeracy for adults. That's not covered in primary school. So that's in the FET sector. We have second chance education, we have skills, we have continuing education, we have apprenticeships, we have lifelong learning, we have new types of working arrangements and so on. And all this is covered by the TVET or FET sector. So what's going on elsewhere? I mentioned New Zealand is probably, I think, probably the first country that began to engage with the issue of tertiary back around 2000 and developed a whole series of underpinning reports. And the Tertiary Education Commission followed and was established. And the kinds of issues it set out then was a broad definition of knowledge, the recognition of the contribution of all forms of knowledge, that recognition to the Maori community in New Zealand, that the tertiary education system should be broadly defined to encompass all formal, non-formal learning. I would add informal into that, and the needs of learners as being central to the design of the system. And so the OECD came at this not beginning in 08, so you see it was later into this game. Scottish Funding Council in 05, the Welsh system, as Simon mentioned, is now beginning to also look around tertiary. The Irish government is moving in this direction to create what it calls a unified, not homogeneous, unified tertiary system for learning skills and knowledge. And there are currently reviews that I know of going on in Australia, Portugal, Norway, and the Netherlands, to name some. So just to end with what I want to call some propositions. One is that, what are we trying to achieve? I guess this is always my first comment. You know, when we look at it, I always kind of ask, well, where are we going with this? Because other than that, you know, using the comment from Alice in Wonderland, is the thing about if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And that's really the issue. What we've got are lots of populist initiatives, lots of things that it's not clear that that they're all moving in the same direction, if I put it like that. So for me, the first thing is looking at as a whole of tertiary strategy from school to adults, but arguably it's part and parcel of much greater thinking about an educational system that runs from cradle to grave. And I think we need to keep that in that context, because we've got so many border fights between primary and preschool, between secondary and primary, and between higher ed, call it that, and the secondary system, blaming each other for their failures or lack of to do what's important. The issue of an integrated, a single agency for tertiary education. We tend to have different systems. They all seem to be speaking to their own agenda. In many cases, they're all speaking to different government departments, both at a federal and a regional basis. And one overarching structure or system or governance arrangements would be, I think, important. It can break down silos. It can become a one-stop shop. It can provide an overarching commonality of purpose. And learners need to be an obligatory part of the system. Having said all that, none of these ideas are foolproof. That's not do this and everything is solved. I mean, even on the issue of a unified agency, it can't solve many of the big issues. You know, it can't, you know, there's always a risk. You know, it can't solve funding, it can't solve skills alignment. It can do certain things, but we do need to look at what are the issues, and many of the issues that we talk about are not supply side problems. And there's also the risk that we end up with something that's homogeneous, and that's not where I'm going with this. Next is a significantly strengthened TVET and FET system, spending much more time focused on it, and indeed the amount of attention that the university system has gotten on the past years in terms of supports and resources and other kinds of developments really now need to be applied to this part of the system. Too often, as I said, it's seen as a second last choice for students, and the system overall has been badly served. One of its key advantages is that when we put and we look at this as place-based and we look at it as an interconnected network, we begin to see how the post-secondary system actually manages to cover huge geographic spread, and particularly into small towns around the country. And that's really an important part of how a network in the system should operate. The issue of credit transfer accumulation, the idea of a porous system where students can move from one part of it to the next, that they don't reach dead ends, and that the system isn't where we do have opportunities for students or learners rather to move from one part of the system to another, to take one course one place and move elsewhere. It's often the decision of the university at the top end that makes those decisions. So I'm keen on the word mandatory being part of it, that we have an opportunity for people of all abilities and to come in and out of the system as their personal and other circumstances change. And that, I think, is important. We are catering increasingly for a more diverse learner population. The issue of regional innovation ecosystems, building on strengths within regions, because we've tended to have a very poor understanding about innovation, about both technological and process innovation, about how skills work, the role of skills, and the fact that skills are what you would call, basically, people are stickier than knowledge. And you're looking to develop the ability for people to stay within the regions that they want to stay in. And then finally, this issue of a revamped funding model. If we're serious about wanting to tackle the issues that we're talking about, then we need to look at the funding model. In my view, funding begets the system. And we have a system that largely relies on college-ready, full-time undergraduate students and doesn't cater, and this goes for most countries, doesn't cater for others. In the UK, we have the lifelong loan scheme being introduced, but if the system and the culture remains the same, then nothing changes. It benefits those who already have the social capital to navigate it. And so we do need to look at how we fund the system. So just finally then is to say, is looking at this issue for what are we trying to achieve? What needs to change? The issue of alignment of vision, policy, leadership, instruments, policy instruments and resources. The fact that governments are unlikely to fund all the tertiary education that we want or need, but it's also clear we can't leave people behind. And fundamentally, the final thing is, I think this is a good time to look at this. In my view, the big state is back. So thanks very much. Sorry about that with the PowerPoint.
Big state is back. Well, yes, maybe it's necessary for quite a few things, including the climate nature emergency, and managing the big state in a democratic manner with a significant bottom up component is the problem, I think, of governance now. But let's look at what the tertiary question. I think the ideas that constitute a tertiary system have been around for a while. I have to say that as a early career or mid-career researcher in Australia in the early 1990s, following the Dawkins reforms to higher education, there were also Dawkins reforms to vocational education and training. And we were trying, all of us who were engaged in this, to bring the two sectors together and create a tertiary approach. And the stumbling block there was that the federal government controlled and funded higher education and the states controlled and funded vocational education and training, and created training markets at a state level. And they were all rather different to each other. And the federal government did try at one point to try and take over the whole of tertiary, and was unsuccessful. There was pushback from the states and pushback from industry as well. So that didn't happen in Australia, but the ideas were around then. And I think all of the components that you very ably listed, were in embryonic form, more embryonic than in your presentation, being talked about there. And I think the logic for a tertiary system is overwhelming, that the advantages are clear. You made a very good case for the single integrated agency and the lift in non-university provision, and the transfer of people from one sector to another being eased up by credit transfer and similar arrangements. And of course, there's also blockages politically. The universities resist often these kinds of reforms, quite comfortable to keep on ruling the roost from where they sit and not changing things. Any change could be a threat to their ultimate control and their status within the tertiary education training system. So look, all were absolutely worth pushing forward on, and perhaps the political will might be there in some countries to do this now. And that's the difference, I think. That's the hope. But just while we're kind of rethinking everything, which is what this entails, I think, two threshold questions. First, in the degree structure of the prestige sector is the degree sector at the moment, and the degree structure, we educate people in these academic discipline-based programs, even in vocational courses, where we use academic modes of assessment and curriculum design and classroom teaching. And it's all about knowledge rather than about skills or applications. And there's always this gap between so-called theory and applications to work and to practice. I mean, you know, if you were sitting down to design a successful tertiary system from zero, would you organize it this way? You know, would you do it through these academic programs, or would you try and devise something more directly related to the kinds of skills which you use not only at work, but in life as a whole? You know, how important is it really to do things using knowledge as the way of organizing and imagining education? I mean, do you think our present academic approach to the whole range of tertiary provision is the right approach, and is it sustainable long term?
Oh, these are really big questions. If had a discussion around the dinner table here as to whether or not people needed to, in the future, learn facts, if they could all pick it up on some kind of computer. Well, I think we have a wider range of what knowledge is and a wider range of skills. I think we've probably tended to too crudely divide these categories. That was my point in talking about very simplistic ideas around knowledge and knowledge production, and you know, other kinds of skills that are equally important, including, you know, these transversal critical skills, analytic skills are equally important when we start looking at, you know, green skills in construction or engineering and other fields. We need these skills all over. So, and I also think that there's a knowledge base when we talk about any of the kinds of programs that we tend to think are just now skill-based, whether it's, let's talk about construction. I mean, there's a huge knowledge base under that. How do you build buildings? How do you make sure they stay up? How do you lay down foundations? I mean, that's not just because you learned how to hammer. So there are huge knowledge bases there that makes the difference between someone who is a skilled carpenter and someone who, to use the term, is a handyman. So I think we've got a very old-fashioned understanding, if I put it like that, about knowledge and skills. But certainly there's also, what we also need to think about is how people use that and want to change over time and move what they're doing. We have a very linear education system. You enter into it and you get out of it. And maybe if you're so lucky, you can come back in at another time. And that, I guess, is one of the problems with the voucher system, is it assumes that you'll come in at some point, but it assumes you've got a knowledge base. I guess that would be some of my concern, that you can just do what are called micro-credentials as individualistic types of things, as opposed to the knowledge base that's there. So tricky question as to what does that look like in the future. But it's certainly probably fair to say that over time, and even now, it probably begins to not matter so much where learning takes place. It takes place in lots of venues and lots of locations and learning sites. And we need to move away from what I would call standardized semesters. There's a whole question of not just credit transfer, but are you getting credentials on the basis of the knowledge gain or time served?
Mhm.
You know, lots of rethinking.
Yeah. And in that context, I mean, this question of, it doesn't matter so much about where we learn, where we're certified to, I mean, on the job training, on job education. I think one of the reasons why the US had such high productivity in the post-war period was the capacity of it to not only sustain a high participation tertiary sector, but also the amount of good quality training taking place in many industries on the job and being passed on, from people to person on the job, with very good mentoring traditions in some sectors and so on. That was more advanced, more developed than in many other countries. Should we be doing more vocational training on the job? And if we do, how do we certify its quality?
Yeah, well, that becomes a big issue. Yeah, there are more and more different types of programs opening up that are combining some kind of practice. I mean, medicine has always been that. So is engineering. They're always had some element of practice. You're going to come out as a doctor and never been in a hospital. No, that's not going to work. So that kind of combination of how you learn, practice-based learning, which has a very poor status representation of ours, but it's exactly what we do. So how do we quality assure that? We need the quality assurance system needs to look at that. In the Irish case, both further and higher education are part and parcel of that same quality assurance system. And I think we're beginning to look at that in a wider context as to how we look not just at that, but cross-border, different types of adjusting the quality assurance system. And it's interesting how QA systems can be as rigid and again anti-innovation as they have been helpful. And so I think that's something we definitely need to be looking at. And I think we will have more, call it training or call it experience. For a long time, the EU, I don't think there are many on it, has been pushing the idea of industrial doctorates. Or indeed, in the Irish case, they now introduce an apprenticeship at level 10, i.e. doctorate level. So as an opportunity for engineers to spend most of their time in a company and then doing up their thesis or project outside of that time. Yeah, so different models, and I think we need to look at that.
Now let's bring in our participants. Kevin McStraganok has the first question.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Ellen, as well, for an interesting presentation. I was wondering what your thoughts are on what quality assurance should look like in an integrated tertiary system, thinking of pre-integration, the fact that the quality assurance systems are often quite different across all the various parts of tertiary and often will consist of a number of different, often state actors that are interacting with institutions, particularly in the case of colleges. They'll probably be operating in a model where they have different forms of quality assurance for higher education and also maybe for vocational education and apprenticeships. So what do you think the role of quality assurance is in a more integrated model, and how does that, I suppose, take form?
Yeah, so thanks, Kevin. I think that's a really important question. I just mentioned it briefly. Yeah, so a lot of the FET comes out of the secondary school model, where we're looking at the inspectorate type of approach. And I think part of the building up and of the FET sector is really looking at the role of college leaders, whether as individually or in networks, and building up college leadership and so on in a way that when we start looking at FET colleges, that they are basically the ones, very much out that the dominant duet university model, if I put it, the HE model, where the universities are really the creditor of its programs, but again, operating within some kind of a framework. But so I think we do need to look at that. I mean, the question Simon asked as to how do we quality assure what's going on outside the classroom? That's all part and parcel of how these programs are being developed. It requires huge commitment from the enterprise sector. Again, we're looking at how do we make this work? But that's where increasingly lots of students want to go, but our opportunities are actually quite limited. And by and large, I mean, I have no preset answer. This is how it should work. These are all issues that we certainly need to look at. And you're right to point out that every country operates its own QA model based upon how it's emerged over time. Some are very top down, some are more bottom up. They vary even across Europe, they vary. So yeah, I think we're going to see them beginning to become much more similar as we move towards recognition of qualifications in line with UNESCO.
Yeah, I mean, I think credentialing is key to changes, and especially changes that involve shifting the status around.
Yeah.
So that if non-university credentials can be certified by employers and by regulatory authority in such a way that they provide, better probabilities of a secure, meaningful employment, they start to look a lot stronger, and then you can work back from that to develop the argument for funding and status in other ways for the non-university sector. But the moment until we get to the point where non-degree credentials have a lot of clout, then the degree credentials de facto are going to be the default that everyone aspires to. Every working class family wants, and this is the case as surveys indicate at the moment. Let's bring in Colin McCaig. Colin.
Hi, thanks Simon, thanks Alan, that was an excellent presentation, but I noticed it mainly obviously your focus is on systems, but there wasn't really much discussion about market drivers bit, which is largely explain why systems have developed and have been so well embedded over the decades. So markets, obviously the very fact that they're there, they beget differentiation, and that obviously favors the elite institutions. So how do we kind of persuade national governments, particularly thinking about the English context, how do we wean them off this idea that the market is the answer to every policy question? Partly when it's elite lobbying, as we know from Oxbridge and some of the upper end of the Russell Group institutions that have a lot of lobbying power amongst policy-making circles. And just as an example to that, to focus back on Kevin's previous question about how do you arrange quality assurance. Well, back in the 90s, there was a brilliant proposal for credit accumulation transfer, which was considered even as part of the Deering Review. It was written by David Robertson, you might remember. And it wasn't even pushed by Deering. Labour didn't feel brave enough to bring that in either. So they persisted with QAA instead, which is peer review. So rather than have a particular, might have been a fairer, but a market-based CAT system, that was kind of rustled, if you like, in the sense that it didn't get past the elite lobby. So we've got this particular version of marketisation in England, but similarly in other countries where they've used market differentiation to try and look at the Excellence Initiative in Germany, for example, where there wasn't a differentiation and there's no fee structure and it's all state-owned, but it's still trying to create differentiation. So, I mean, I'll definitely sign up into your manifesto, and I hope it works. But I'm just wondering how you help us wean governments off, particularly our government.
Thanks very much. Well, on your issue on credit transfer, yeah, I'm aware of the experiment tried or suggested in England. And people said, oh, well, if that was tried, it didn't work. We can't go back there again. The US has some kind of voluntary system around credit transfer. I mean, I'm a transfer person, 40% of people in the US transfer. But having said that, in those systems, they're captured, they're basically universally captured. So, you know, even in bilateral agreements, you know, the university system said, you haven't quite read my book here on this course, and it's not really the same, and you can't really do this, and blah, blah. That's why I think it needs to work on a national basis. It needs to be mandatory. There's a whole QA structure underneath that needs to work. And yes, the governments need to be convinced. And what's they're convincing? I think the world-class model is has gone past its sell-by date. That's not to say that we don't have that kind of thing, but that kind of a model which suggests that we should have a few institutions at the top is beggaring systems. And we've ended up in a situation where the majority of our population, as I said, we have a regressive educational system. We don't use that term to talk about the educational system, but that's what it is. So those who have the most get the most out of it. And we now understand the huge economic problems that have come from that when we look at distribution of skill and skill needs, economic needs, the productivity issue that's there in the UK, for example, and we have issues over huge, massive regional disparity. And we have on top of that, the socio-political questions that are now big issues underpinning democratic societies. So we have a combination of factors that we have ignored, and I think are now put this kind of issue on the agenda. It's not an easy switch. England in particular finds it very difficult. It may move towards more regions, and a regional approach, and that's going to kind of a semi-federal model. My only warning on that is that I think that's a good idea, but my warning is to ensure that there's an overarching framework. Otherwise, you end up with little Texases and Floridas doing their own thing outside of, and so your access depends on which part of the country you're born in, and that can't really be the basis of an educational system either. So none of these are without foolproof. I mean, New Zealand does very well, but it has no credit transfer system. It's again in hoc to the university. So everyone is struggling with how we make this a more inclusive, porous system. But once we begin to think about these issues, I think that's an important first step.
Yeah, need to keep the conversation going.
Yep.
Persuade the policymakers.
I mean, credit transfer is really difficult. I worked on a project in Tertiary University in Melbourne, and where they have a combined institution which has degree level higher education and vocational education and training at all levels, and including late secondary years, and to try and get transfer from one part of the institution to the other through in a credit transfer model was impossible. The academic resistance was total, and there were a succession of inquiries and committees. Everyone agreed in principle. No one would implement it properly in practice. Yeah. The resistances are profound. So so there are real log jams there.
Just on that, my comment generally between what you've just described, Simon, and other issues we get our academics are not innocent victims.
No. No, and it's to be blunt, it's the second and third tier institutions where often people are most precious about maintaining their status. Status differentials might be narrower, but they're policed. I think your critique of the world-class university model is really salutary and really welcome. So many eggs have been put in that basket. The sort of golden chariot that's going to lead the nations to everything. The knowledge economy has been centered on the WCU notion, which is such a narrow base and has emptied out skill development across the economy. I think that's really strong point and really much overdue. and there's an interesting webinar to be held on that topic.
Yeah, I would just, if I could, sorry, do
Mm.
we have a second to just add a point to it? I just had that discussion recently on that same issue, and there are other ways to build research and knowledge capacity and innovation that aren't all about putting it into one basket.
Mhm,
And one needs to look at, and that's why I put forward the 4 C's.
mm. Now let's bring in Josh Patel. Josh, are you there?
Yeah, hi. Thanks very much, Simon, and thanks, Ellen. This has been really interesting. Just really quickly, most of the kind of stuff, a discussion around tertiary policy seems to be very much at that policy level. And I was wondering if you had any idea or any awareness of any studies about how lived student experiences of their learning and their outcomes might or do differ between the kind of existing post-secondary education systems we have at the moment and these emerging tertiary ecosystems that you're talking about, or is it too early really to say? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. I don't know any. I know that Paul Ashwin, who's part of the CG group, is proposing a study that's going to look at some issues around learning outcomes across systems, taking in vocation. I mean, I think this is one of the sad bits of it, is that the higher education studies community largely studies itself, and there's very little attention at these wider sets of issues. There's very little knowledge about it, and there's very little studying that takes place. But no, simple answer, no, I'm afraid I don't, sorry.
There's interesting cases though, and it might be worth looking at individual institutions and what they're saying about what they're doing. You know, I'm thinking of, for example, of, you know, Middlesex University in the UK, what the former Middlesex Polytechnic, which has a very close relationship with FE, and where there's quite a lot of transfer going on and some combined qualifications being developed. So it might, you know, be worth looking at their website and seeing what they're saying. And Tim Blackman, who was the former Vice Chancellor there, who's gone to the Open University in the UK as VC, is an expert on these issues and problems. So it'd be interesting to see what he's saying about learning outcomes in relation to those who are working in a more tertiary-like framework. Ellen, I've got one more question while we've got you, because you look always at the US and you know what's happening to a degree in the United States as well as what's happening in Europe. There's, you know, disturbing signs of a sort of radical disillusionment, withdrawal from commitment to post-school education in the United States. There's a number of different indicators here. I mean, one is the falling away of enrollments, obviously, but that's not just demographic. It's partly also about people at the bottom levels in the community colleges and in the for-profits not having the same incentive to participate, or perhaps the costs of participation being inhibiting them. There's also talk about some government instrumentalities no longer requiring degrees for certain kinds of employment. There's a lot of scuttlebutt about higher ed. Of course, there's the Republican Party in general withdrawing its consent and support for universities as institutions across the board in many places. But you know, have we seen a peak? You know, are we past the peak of commitment of the society to post-school education in a formal sense? Is it in trouble or in decline in the US longer term, do you think?
Whoa, that's a really tough question. But yes, you're right. There's been a fall off. Depends somewhat on states, but you also have a lot of states that, not least quote purple states such as Pennsylvania, who are no longer requiring a credential for employment. Now, I think what they're also trying to do is open it up. One of the things that slightly always concerns me about it, whenever we think about credentials, at least it's somewhat transparent. Now we move into an untransparent way of making appointments. But it's ideological. It's also about whether or not, hugely ideological. To some extent, we don't see that being repeated elsewhere. But in the US has results have just come out from PISA, the lowest literacy and numeracy rates in the US is falling, but it goes back to, let's say, the argument about the world class. So we focus a lot on the top 10 or 20, which are all dominated by US privates, and the rest of the system is in a dire state. where fewer and fewer dollars have been spent. The regional universities, that's not the flagship within the states. The regionals are suffering. They don't have enough money. They have withdrawal of that. And yeah, is it fatal? I don't know. But I mean, even if you looked at the research enterprise in the US, over 50% of that work is being done by immigrant students, international students. It's not done by the domestic, if you want to call it that, native domestic population.
Yeah.
So huge, I mean, people who look at the US and say, this is our model. And I would say, no, it's not your model.
Yes, wrong way, go
It's
back.
not your model.
Yeah, and there's the escalating cost of tuition.
Oh,
Yeah.
the escalating cost of
Two
tuition.
decades.
is huge. Well, now you have to look at the difference. Are we talking about price or cost? And what's going on here?
Yeah,
And how much does it really cost to run these things? And this is where the elites will also tell you, oh, we don't worry about that. We never actually charge what's on the sheet. I don't believe it for a moment.
yes, and of course they can change the ratio of those who are paying full fee. and those who are paying
Absolutely,
part fee,
absolutely.
whenever it suits
People
them.
getting in through back doors, and I get it around the SAT, and people don't like that kind of thing, these high stakes exams. I get it, I understand, but now we're in that murky world.
Yeah,
How
elite
are
institutions
decisions being made?
making their own rules, elite institutions setting their own framework as it suits them, I think
Yeah,
kind
yeah,
of vulnerable long term
Yeah.
to lots of community and state support.
Yeah.
We're really valuable discussion with you, and the tertiary issues that you laid out today were great, and I think that people are going to have a lot of benefit from the YouTube video of your presentation. So, Ellen, thank you very much. It's
You're
great that
very welcome. Thank you all.
you're doing what you're doing, and small but powerful group today of participants. We've in terms of the forthcoming webinar program, we've got a bit of a gap. We've got a gap on Tuesday, and then with our communications officer away, we haven't scheduled a webinar for Tuesday, but on Thursday, myself back on screen talking about the public good role of higher education in the UK. We've done a set of interviews with policymakers and with tertiary institutions in the UK on the question of, does higher education still have a public good role, or is it all just about individual private benefits for students and graduates? So tackling that question, reviewing the evidence that's been gathered in the study, and looking also at the way in which the policymakers in the succession of national reports have treated this issue over a period of time. That'll be Thursday next week. And then after that, our next webinar will be from Rose Eda from the Philippines on the 4th of July. So look forward to seeing you for both of those, and stay in touch on the tertiary issues. I think they're going to run, and we'll have Ellen back again before too long. I hope to talk again about the issue of going from higher education to tertiary education and what that means for all of us. So thank you again, and bye for now.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.